Hello, my name's Hannah Williams, and I'm a spiritual mentor and aspirant teaching and studying in a classical tantric tradition since 2015. And today we're going to talk about bad gurus. And just as a reminder, if you're new here, this is literally just me talking. There's no visuals, so it's better to just kind of like listen to this like it's a podcast, sit back, relax, clean your room, go for a walk. You know, it's a low-key experience. So anywho, I always like to say that. But today we're gonna talk about how it's possible that someone could be legitimately enlightened but also be a bad person, or do things that we find to be morally awful, right? You know, like all of the scandals that have occurred in the last several decades with spiritual leaders all around the world. And it may be easy to think that the existence of these bad behaviors must mean that they were never enlightened in the first place, right? But that's actually the wrong way of looking at it and will get you nowhere, okay? So today I am going to explain exactly why you can be enlightened and also have a terrible personality, because these are separate issues, okay? And you may be surprised by what you learn, what I say here. This may be very surprising and illuminating, actually. So let's get right into it. The modern spiritual world faces a very critical paradox, which is the existence of harmful, bad gurus. And these are the leaders of spiritual lineages or organizations who exhibit cult-like, unethical, or even violent behavior. And this is one of the biggest reasons that people, rightfully so, hesitate to join any spiritual community. And I deeply emphasize with anyone who's ever been hurt by a high control group or an abusive teacher-student dynamic. I have worked with many students over the years who have survived these conditions, so I understand and emphasize deeply with the immensity of these experiences. But at the same time, I attribute almost all of my growth to the teacher-student relationship, and I teach about the value of the saints in the world. And so I see this incredible value in the teacher-student relationship. And I have been a student of my Zero Controversies guru for 10 years, and I feel so much gratitude to him and so much gratitude for our relationship. So because of my individual life experience, I find myself often advocating for these teacher-student relationships while also recognizing that there are, of course, problems that can arise in these dynamics, right? So that's just where I'm coming from. So if we don't want to abolish the presence of spiritual teachers entirely, which I personally don't think is the way, we need to address something. In order for us to move forward, we need to address a very important question. How on earth is it possible that somebody could be highly realized, fully enlightened, and spiritually advanced, but also be like a terrible, harmful person? Okay, so let's explore this. Well, first of all, actually, why should we explore this? Because if we explore this idea, we can begin to heal and we can begin to build healthier, more grounded spiritual communities. I work as a spiritual guide and I see people craving this all the time. So people want this. And on an even deeper level, if we can hold the paradox that even the most flawed individuals can still act as vessels for divine wisdom, then maybe, just maybe, we can begin to see that holiness is not reserved for the perfect. It's alive in us too. It's alive in you too. Despite your contradictions, despite your mistakes, and despite your holy humanity, okay? So let's get into it. This whole talk was actually sparked by a conversation that I was having with a friend who was really struggling to reconcile how Chögyam Trungpa, someone so clearly in a state of spiritual clarity and deep realization, could also be an alcoholic who had sex with his students, right? And if you're unfamiliar with Trungpa, he played a very pivotal role in bringing Tibetan Buddhism to the West. First in London, then in the US, eventually settling in Boulder, Colorado. And so you've probably heard the term mindfulness or like mindfulness meditation. Well, guess what, guys? That's thanks to Trungpa, okay? The phrase mindfulness meditation is an adaptation of Sanskrit shamatha, meaning calm abiding, which is a practice that's actually traditionally paired with vipassana or clear seeing, okay? So shamatha stabilizes the mind, and vipassana cultivates awareness and wisdom. And all of this actually makes my friend's question even more striking, because Trungpa practiced and taught clarity, yet his own life was completely chaotic and self-destructive, right? Like, it's almost hilarious. Now, Trungpa was a Tibetan Buddhist. And one of my very close friends is also a Tibetan Buddhist, and we often talk about the differences between our religious traditions. I practice classical Tantra, and from our perspective, I'm going to explain from our perspective, if we want to understand how someone could embody both high realization and harmful behavior, we have to start with one very important thing, which is the ego, okay? So one thing to understand immediately is that spiritual power, the generation of spiritual power, siddhi, magical abilities, etc., has nothing to do with morality. Period. You don't become a siddha, a perfected being with spiritual powers, because you're a good person, whatever good means, right? The powers of a siddha arise through spiritual practice, ritual, austerities, and of course, grace, right? Which, if you know me, it's all about grace. And this is exactly where people get hung up. The idea of goodness or worthiness is so deeply ingrained in us, likely due to a Christian or Muslim upbringing, that most people assume that being enlightened must mean being the most good, the most worthy. But enlightenment is not a moral pursuit. In my tradition, it's about refining the mind and re-identifying the ego, okay? That being said, some practices that shift the ego's grip can lead to personal transformation. I'm not saying that's not a thing. A genuine commitment to selfless service, for example, might make you a more compassionate person, right? Like, there's side effects. Devotion can soften your heart. You might just find yourself becoming a human Hanuman as you devote your life to him, okay? So it can make us a good person. But let's not also forget the main villain of the Ramayana, the epic of Hanuman, Lord Ram, and Sita. Sita was stolen by Ravana, the king of the demons. And yet what's absolutely fascinating about Ravana is that he wasn't just some mindless force of evil. He was deeply devoted, a bhakta of Lord Shiva. He composed an entire hymn in Shiva's praise. It's called the Shiva Tandava Stotram. He was a brilliant scholar, he was a master of the Vedas, and he was a highly accomplished yogi. And through all of this, Lord Shiva favored him. God favored the demon. And here's Ravana, king of the demons, right? And so here in the scripture, we see that devotion, spiritual practice, and even divine favor don't automatically make you good, okay? Ravana had immense spiritual power, but his ego, his sense of superiority, his entitlement was entirely unchecked. And that's exactly what led to his downfall at the hands of Lord Ram at the very end, right? So here we have a story that helps us to understand how someone can be highly realized, deeply immersed in spiritual practice, and still act harmfully. Ravana was no ordinary being. He had great yogic attainment. And yet his unchecked ego, his desire for Sita, his arrogance in his own knowledge led him to commit a great evil or a great wrong. He stole Lord Ram's wife. So what is this ego? And what role does it play in enlightenment, or as in my tradition we would call it, God realization? So God realization occurs when a yogi, aspirant, or any speaker on any non-dual path directly experiences in a 100% felt non-intellectual way that everything in the universe is God, that God alone is. This isn't just an idea that you hold in your mind, it's a direct lived experience. It's when the mind shifts entirely to a new level of perception where the presence of God becomes undeniable, both seen and felt in all things, everything. But notice what I just said, when the mind shifts, okay? So in a profound way, God realization happens when the mind has been purified. But it's not merely a mental process. It's a shift in awareness itself. So the body is involved, of course, as is the heart, but transformation on this level is fundamentally mental. And the greatest shift happens within the ego, not through its destruction, but through its surrender to the vastness of divine awareness, which is the source of your individual awareness. So in our tradition, God realization becomes most possible when the ego shifts from being devoted only to itself to becoming a devotee of everything and the source of everything, okay? So what is the ego? The ego is one of the three fundamental functions of the mind. In my religious tradition, classical Shakta Tantra, this comes from Kashmir Shaivism, the mind has three parts. Manas, processing, buddhi, intellect, ahamkara, ego. I'm not going to get into the first two right now. I got more on this in my talk, The Ego 101, which you can find on my Patreon, but it's important to understand the function of the ego here in this trinity, because the very name of the ego reveals the nature of the ego. So the Sanskrit word ahamkara breaks down into aham, I am, and kara, the doer. Ahamkara literally means I am the doer, okay? So the ego is the part of us that believes that we are the ones making everything happen. I am the one thinking. I am the one acting. I am the one achieving. It's the feeling that we as individuals are in control. But in non-dual tantra, this very sense of I'm the one doing it is actually what keeps us stuck in maya, or the illusion of separateness. It makes everything feel so personal. It's like we're separate from the rest of existence, me versus everyone else. But through deep spiritual practice and inquiry, something can shift. It's not that actions stop happening, but the idea that we are the ones making them happen starts to fade away. And in that space, we begin to see the deeper truth that everything is moving, flowing, unfolding, not because of us, but because of something much bigger than us, okay? So in other words, God realization is seeing that all action, all movement, everything that happens is not our doing. It's Shakti. It's divine. It's God doing everything. She does everything and always has. So to summarize what I've shared so far, this is what I've said so far because this is kind of a lot. God realization is the direct knowing that there is no separate doer. There is only God, only Shakti. The ego, ahamkara, is the I am function of our mind. It's the identifier, the sense of being a distinct, separate individual. And of course, we need this identification system to navigate our life, by the way. How could you go to work with it, you know? But you need to learn how to deal with it, how to not be bound by it. And so I go into much more depth about this in my talk, The Ego 101 on my Patreon. But here's where people get stuck. Here, let's bring it back. If enlightenment is a shift in perception, if it's about seeing through the illusion of separateness, then where does morality come into play? If someone has truly realized that all action arises from divine Shakti itself, shouldn't that naturally make them a better person or a good person? Shouldn't they act in ways that align with our ideas of kindness and integrity and selflessness? Well, this is where we have to confront a very difficult truth. You don't need to be a good person to be enlightened. Enlightenment is not a reward for moral behavior. It is not something bestowed upon the most ethical, most self-sacrificing, or compassionate among us. That assumption comes from a deeply ingrained, often religious idea that spiritual attainment must be tied to virtue, that holiness is something that is earned through our good deeds. But the reality is far more unsettling. Enlightenment is about perception, not personality. So with this understanding, it becomes very easy to see how figures like Chögyam Trungpa could exist. People who were clearly in an enlightened, illuminated state, yet behaved in ways that were confusing and harmful. And so Trungpa, let's talk about him. He was an extraordinarily accomplished practitioner. He rigorously trained in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition from an extremely young age. And he was actually recognized as a tulku, a reincarnated master, and received full monastic ordination and completed the intense meditative and yogic disciplines of his lineage, completely hardcore practitioner. So his deep realization and ability to transmit Dharma came from his unwavering dedication to practice. Not from his personality, not from his moral choices, and not from his personal conduct, period, okay? His clarity and insight arose from his mastery of meditation, ritual, and devotion, not from being a good person in the conventional sense, okay? Enlightenment is a shift in perception. And Trungpa's perception was undeniably refined, even if his actions remained deeply flawed and deeply human, okay? Now, that's just one problematic figure. You can't swing a cat without hitting a controversy in the world of gurus, okay? But you could apply the same basic principle that we've been discussing here to explain what has happened and is still happening within various spiritual communities and with various spiritual leaders. Now, let me say this for the millionth time today in case it isn't clear. Their power does not come from being a good person. Any spiritual leader's power comes from dedication to practice, study, and austerity. Just like Ravana, you can be a master yogi and still have some serious personality issues, okay? And here's the thing. Many bad gurus out there might not even be fully enlightened, right? But they still inevitably gather people around them because they've got something going on. It's the same way that almost every cult starts. In the beginning, people experience something genuinely transformative. And you know what's really interesting? Most people who get sucked into cults are actually very smart people. But they fall for the sunk cost fallacy. They want to chase that initial high until before they know it, they've handed over their entire life to a dubious leader, okay? And so these powerful figures have something going on. They're offering something legitimate at first. But spiritual power does not come from them being good. People aren't gathering necessarily because they're good, okay? And of course, there are certain spiritual practices that can refine the ego and refine our personality and lead us to have better behavior, but it's not a requirement. Not even close. It's abundantly clear that it's not a requirement. But the only reason why people struggle to accept this is because it would shatter their belief that morality, goodness, and worthiness are the key ingredients to success on the spiritual path. And if that feels unsettling to you, you probably have some deconditioning to you. You probably have some deconditioning to do. Whether it's from the religious framework that you were raised in, or from the cultural norms that you have absorbed. There's some deconditioning that needs to happen. We tend to assume that enlightenment should lead to moral goodness because on some level, we still think of it as a reward when one of the obstacles to enlightenment is actually want of reward, okay? As if the universe, God, or karma will only grant us deep realization to those who have earned it through virtue. But that's not how spiritual attainment works. A person doesn't master yoga or meditation because they're nice. They don't gain mystical insight because they've treated other people well. These things come from practice, discipline, and surrender regardless of your personality. And history has shown us this over and over and over again. Powerful spiritual figures can be wise, charismatic, and even deeply insightful while still being flawed, selfish, and even abusive. And we don't like that because it forces us to accept that moral goodness is not an automatic byproduct of realization. It may even lead us to feel hopeless. Like this thing that I'm saying right now could make you feel hopeless. Like there isn't a force of good in the world that will reward us if we're just nice enough or selfless enough or kind enough. But that's not even true, and it has never been true. Your unconscious beliefs about enlightenment might actually be a self-worth issue in disguise. Like, how could I ever be enlightened? I'm such a bad person. I'm just not good enough, so spirituality isn't for me. Well, now you know that's actually not how it works, sweetheart. And so this is a hard pill to swallow, but it's the truth. And the spiritual movements of the 60s, 70s, and 80s showed us exactly what happens when people conflate spiritual realization with ethical integrity. And this is how I want to end my talk on the ego and bad gurus. Something very important happened to spirituality in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The philosophy and religion of the so-called East met the philosophy and mentality of the so-called West, and absolute chaos ensued. Absolute chaos ensued. So let's return to Trungpa for a moment. He's like the center of this talk. Like I said, he was an accomplished practitioner from a very young age. He was raised in a somewhat conservative society, until, of course, he had to flee Tibet due to the Chinese invasion. Okay, that's his story. Now, let's set the scene of what's happening around this time. The 60s and 70s in the US and Europe were all about questioning social norms, rejecting tradition, and pushing cultural boundaries. It was a rebellion against rigid systems. Free love, right? That's a big one in this talk. Psychedelic-fueled spiritual exploration. And there was a very big surge in alternative ways of being. And then, right in the middle of this revolution of thought and mind, yogis from India and the Far East flooded into the West, okay? So Westerners, many of whom had their first taste of expanded consciousness through psychedelics, were absolutely fascinated by these Eastern practitioners. Well, why was that? Because these monks seemed to be permanently high, but they were completely sober, except for Trungpa, but most of them were sober. So naturally, people wanted to learn from them. And Ram Dass actually says this in the best way. He aptly says it just like this. Why did we purify? Because we were tired of getting high and then coming down again. And so that's the nutshell version, and that's enough for now, but this was the situation of what was happening. On one side, you've got Westerners, completely in awe of these monks who had somehow attained peace, contentment, and higher states of consciousness through nothing but meditation, no substances, no external aids, just pure inner work. And on the other side, you have these Eastern monks, men who had trained in incredibly strict, highly controlled environments of chastity and discipline, suddenly being thrown into a world that they were absolutely not prepared for. These were celibate monks, raised in monastic traditions that equated spiritual power with desirelessness. They lived in isolation, away from the noise of the world, no dating, no jobs, no marriage, okay? And beyond just their personal vows that they took as monks, as sannyas, they came from deeply conservative cultures where chastity was expected and strict rules governed how women should dress, behave, and interact with men, period, okay? And then almost overnight, they found themselves in a world that was the exact opposite. Not just different, completely alien to them. Because while these monks had spent their lives restraining desire, the West was in the middle of throwing it off completely. Women were having casual sex before marriage. People were rejecting modesty. People were breaking away from traditional gender roles. The entire concept of desire and restraint was being turned on its head during the hippie revolution. Now, to us today, none of that seems shocking. But 50 years ago, it was mind-blowing. I think we've been conditioned to see the hippie movement as this kind of like cute surface level white-led revolution. But in reality, it was one of the most radical, culture-shattering shifts of the 20th century and even hundreds of years. So just imagine it. I'm kind of an advocate for the hippie movement. Just imagine it. For decades, people wore suits and hats just to go to the grocery store. Modesty was not just a virtue, it was an expectation. And then almost overnight, everything changed. In the late 50s, 60s, and 70s, people threw away their suits. They grew out their hair. They stopped shaving their armpits. They staged smoke-ins at government buildings. They refused to work. It was a total cultural upheaval. And right in the middle of it all, these Eastern monks and teachers, men who had spent their entire lives in strict, celibate, highly structured traditions, suddenly found themselves in a world unlike anything they had ever encountered. The collision was inevitable. So all of this to say, the astronomical social change in the West collided with the conservative, celibacy-driven spirituality of the East, and well, you can guess what happened next. It's pretty obvious how this was going to go. These monks who had zero training in actually dealing with their desires suddenly found themselves surrounded by people, men and women alike, who had zero hang-ups about sex all of a sudden. It was the perfect storm. And so if you add some heightened states of consciousness into the mix and you have the perfect environment for gurus to start having sex with their disciples, it's like, what else would happen, guys? What else would happen? There was no precedent for this historically. And so because of that, we learned a lot, messily and painfully and undeniably cruelly at times, what happens when these worlds collide. And so let me be clear, I do not want to minimize the harm that has been caused by this collision. The pain that people have felt at the hands of dubious spiritual leaders is real and should never be dismissed. And yet, despite all of that, we learned something crucial. We learned something so important. We learned that you can be in a high spiritual state and still be deeply flawed. And we learned blatantly that refining perception is not enough. That spirituality without ethical development is dangerous, okay? And so this is the lesson that we have to start embodying in the 21st century. All the wisdom of perception, the practices, the tapasya, the philosophy, all of this stuff still matters. I believe that religious traditions still matter. But what's needed now is the next step, to evolve not just our consciousness, but our character. To refine not just our awareness, but our actions. It's no longer enough to say, I've awakened, I have won this game. Because if consciousness is raised without conduct, people will continue to be alienated and traumatized by the spiritual path. And let's be honest, the world needs raised consciousness if we are all going to survive. Look at the fucking world. Look at the fucking world. Look at the trajectory that we're on, okay? And so this is the lesson that we have to take from the spiritual movements of the 60s and 70s. Raising consciousness alone is not enough. Conduct must evolve alongside our realization. And again, we've seen figures with profound spiritual insight, but unchecked personalities harming others in the process of the awakening, okay? The mistake is assuming that wisdom automatically begets goodness. It doesn't. If we truly want to build spiritual communities that are both transformative and ethical, we have to stop seeing enlightenment as separate from responsibility. The path forward isn't just about awakening. It's about integrating that awakening into our actions. Consciousness must be expanded, yes, but conduct needs to be refined in tandem with that. Otherwise, we're just going to keep making the same mistakes over and over and over again, and that is something that we simply cannot afford. We simply cannot afford that, okay? So that's my message for you all today. We must raise our consciousness and our conduct. And that is what all of the bad gurus of today and yesteryear are teaching us actively, okay? That's what they're teaching us. So thank you so much for listening. If you're still here, Jai Ma. Again, my name's Hana, and I'm a spiritual mentor and aspirant studying and teaching in a classical tantric tradition. If you'd like to learn more, be sure to subscribe, like and subscribe. But I also have a Patreon, which is my library of talks and courses. My main course and the heart of everything I teach is called Grace 101, which is relevant to this talk that I gave today. The first part is free on Patreon. You just need to join as a free member to listen. But other than that, my Patreon is fully loaded with 50 plus talks. I add something new about once a month, and we do live Q&A sessions every other week, and all of that's recorded. And so other than that, I work with people one-on-one. As a mentor, you can do a 6-month mentorship with me, or you can do a one-off call. All of this can be found on my website, and I'll link it below. And I'd love to hear from you and be a support person in your life if you feel called to that. But other than that, I'd love to hear what you think about this talk, if you have any feedback, if this really connected some dots for you in your mind, just anything you think about this talk. I'd love to hear from you guys. My channel is growing. I'm still very small, so I will see every comment that you write, and I'd love to just see what you think and maybe give you some give you my perspective if you have further questions, okay? And so that's pretty much it. I don't know if you've noticed, but I have my little Anandamaya Ma over here, a pure sattvic being, devoid of controversy. So she was watching over us today. Jai Ma, thank you.